Right now, underneath one of the most densely populated coastlines in Europe, the ground is rising, cracking, and shaking, in a pattern scientists have only ever recorded twice before in the last 500 years. On the night of July 31st, 2026, a magnitude 4.7 earthquake tore through the Campi Flegrei region just west of Naples, Italy. It was shallow, it was violent for its size, and it injured at least 26 people. Several unoccupied buildings collapsed. Part of a cliff face crumbled into the sea. Thousands of residents spent the night outside, too afraid to go back indoors in case a larger aftershock followed. And here is the detail that should genuinely concern you. This wasn't some random tectonic accident. This earthquake happened directly above one of the largest and most dangerous volcanic calderas on the entire planet, a supervolcano that has been quietly, relentlessly building pressure for more than 2 decades. Today, we're going to break down exactly what has been discovered, what the new research says about a possible critical threshold by the early 2030s, why this is fundamentally different from anything Yellowstone or any other supervolcano is currently doing, and what it would actually mean for the roughly 3 million people who live in its shadow. No exaggeration, no doomsday theater, just the data and what it actually tells us. If you've ever wondered what it looks like when an entire city sits on top of a slowly swelling volcanic system, stay with me. Because this story has been building for 20 years, and it just crossed a new threshold that scientists did not expect to see this soon. Before we go further, drop a comment and tell me if you knew that Europe even had a supervolcano, because most people have never heard the name Campi Flegrei, even though it sits right next to one of the most visited coastlines in Italy. If stories like this matter to you, go ahead and subscribe now, because we track every major shift in seismic and volcanic activity around the world, and a story like this one moves fast. A thumbs up genuinely helps more people see this, so if you find this useful, tap it before we continue. Now let's actually get into what's happening underneath Naples. Campi Flegrei translates to the Phlegrean fields, and the name itself comes from the Greek word for burning, given to this landscape by ancient settlers who watched steam and sulfur rise out of the ground for as long as anyone could remember. It sits just west of Naples, and unlike most volcanoes you picture in your head, it has no single looming cone. There's no Mount Fuji shape, no single peak you can point a camera at and say, that's the volcano. Campi Flegrei is a caldera, a vast collapsed depression roughly 12 to 14 kilometers across, formed tens of thousands of years ago, when a colossal eruption emptied out a massive underground magma chamber and the ground above it caved in on itself. Part of that caldera sits on land, part of it is submerged beneath the Bay of Pozzuoli, and scattered across the whole structure are 24 separate craters and volcanic vents, remnants of roughly 70 eruptions that have occurred inside this caldera since its last major collapse. This is not a dormant curiosity sitting quietly in the background of Italian geography. This is an active, breathing volcanic system, and right now, in the second half of 2026, it is breathing harder than it has in generations. To understand why the July 31st earthquake matters so much, you need to understand the phenomenon that has defined this region for centuries, something volcanologists call bradyseism. The word comes from Greek, brades, meaning slow, and seismos, meaning movement. It describes the gradual rising and sinking of the ground surface caused by pressure changes in the magma chamber and hydrothermal system sitting several kilometers beneath the caldera. This isn't a new phenomenon at Campi Flegrei. Roman-era ruins in the region show clear evidence of both submersion and reemergence over the centuries, structures that were built on dry land, then slowly sank beneath the waterline as the ground subsided, only for later structures to be built again once the ground rose back up. The most famous evidence of this sits at the so-called Temple of Serapis, an ancient Roman marketplace, where you can still see marine boring holes from shellfish on columns that once stood entirely underwater before rising back above sea level. This place has been rising and sinking for thousands of years, but what has been happening since 2005 is different, not in kind, but in scale and persistence, and that difference is exactly what has scientists paying closer attention than they have in 40 years. The modern chapter of this story really begins in the mid-2000s. Since 2005, the ground at the center of the caldera, particularly beneath the town of Pozzuoli, has been rising steadily, and it has not stopped. Different measurement stations give slightly different totals depending on exactly where you're standing, but the consistent figure across multiple studies is that the ground has lifted somewhere between 1.1 and 1.6 meters since that uplift began, with some newer estimates pushing even higher as 2026 progresses. To put that in perspective, imagine standing in your living room and watching the floor slowly rise more than a meter over 2 decades without you ever being able to feel it happening in real time, only measure it after the fact. That kind of sustained, unbroken uplift over such a long time frame is not something this volcanic system has done since the lead-up to its last actual eruption in 1538. And the uplift has not been happening in isolation. It has been accompanied every step of the way by increasing seismicity, and that seismicity has been getting sharper and more frequent in exactly the months leading into this year's crisis. Between February 23rd and March 1st of 2026, seismographs run by Italy's National Institute of Geophysics and Volcanology, known as INGV, recorded approximately 70 earthquakes in a single week beneath the caldera, with magnitudes reaching as high as 3. 5 concentrated beneath Pozzuoli and the nearby Agnano area. The following week brought some relief, with the count dropping to 47 events, still elevated compared to historical baselines, but a step down from the spike. Then, on May 21st, 2026, a shallow magnitude 4. 4 earthquakes struck the caldera at a depth of roughly 3 kilometers, setting off a swarm of 12 additional earthquakes concentrated offshore between the Pozzuoli and Boccoli sectors before the sequence was declared finished later that day. That earthquake was felt across the entire Naples area. Local authorities ordered precautionary school closures in the Bagnoli Fuori Grotta zone, one of the officially designated high-risk red zones, while engineers carried out emergency inspections of public and private buildings. And then, just over 2 months later, on the night of July 31st, the magnitude 4. 7 earthquake hit. The strongest of this entire accelerating sequence, shallow enough to cause real structural damage and real injuries, and strong enough that it made international headlines for the first time in years. What makes these earthquakes particularly unsettling isn't necessarily their size on paper, a magnitude. Pretus 4. 7 earthquake, in most parts of the world, wouldn't make national news. But depth changes everything, and these earthquakes are extremely shallow, some at depths of only 2 to 3 kilometers beneath the surface. Shallow earthquakes translate almost all of their energy directly into surface shaking, with very little rock between the rupture and the buildings above to absorb that energy. Combine that shallow depth with the fact that Pozzuoli and the surrounding towns include a significant amount of older, unreinforced construction, and you get an earthquake that punches well above its magnitude in terms of actual damage and terror on the ground. Residents describe a now familiar routine that has become part of daily life in the red zone. The tremor hits, furniture shakes, people run into the streets, and then everyone waits to see if a larger aftershock follows. One longtime resident, describing the psychological toll of living inside an active caldera, said that people in the area are in a near constant state of anxiety, that even a small tremor sends them running outside. That is not a description of a place experiencing an isolated bad week. That is a description of a population that has been living inside a slow-motion crisis for years. So the natural question becomes, why is this happening now? And why is 2026 different from the last 20 years of gradual background-level unrest? This is where the science gets genuinely fascinating, and where a research paper published in April of 2026 changed the conversation entirely. A team of researchers analyzed 26 years of continuous data at Campi Flegrei, from January 2000 through January 2026, combining 2 separate geophysical measurements. The first was continuous satellite positioning data tracking vertical ground deformation with extreme precision. The second was what's called cumulative Benioff strain, essentially a running tally of the total seismic energy being released beneath the caldera over time. When the researchers modeled these 2 decades of data, they found something that immediately stood out. The acceleration in both ground deformation and seismic energy release was not following a simple exponential curve, the kind of steady, gradually intensifying pattern you'd expect from a system slowly building towards some vague future point. Instead, the data fit what's known as a finite time singularity model far better, a pattern where the rate of change itself keeps accelerating in a way that points toward a specific, calculable moment when the system reaches a critical mechanical threshold. Let's break that down in plain terms, because the phrase finite time singularity sounds intimidating, but the underlying idea is actually fairly intuitive. Think about bending a stick. If you apply slow, steady pressure to a stick, for a long time it bends without breaking. But there comes a point where the rate at which it's bending starts to increase on its own, not because you're pushing any harder, but because the internal structure of the stick is weakening from the strain it has already absorbed. It creaks faster and faster, and if you plotted that creaking rate against time, the curve would shoot upward sharply as you approach the snap. That upward shooting curve, mathematically, resembles a finite time singularity. It doesn't mean an explosion is guaranteed. It means the system is behaving less like something in a stable holding pattern and more like something approaching a structural limit. When the research team applied this model to Campi Flegrei's 26 years of uplift and seismic strain data, the statistical fit was significantly stronger than the standard exponential growth model, and it held up consistently across nearly every time window they tested, whether they started their analysis from the year 2000 or from more recent years. Based on that model, the projected time frame for the system to reach this critical mechanical threshold falls within the next decade, with several outlets and researchers pointing specifically to a window opening around 2033, give or take a few years, depending on how the input data is refined going forward. Now here's the part that matters most. and it's the part that gets lost in a lot of the sensationalized coverage online. A critical mechanical threshold does not automatically mean an eruption. What the researchers are describing is a point at which the crust above the magma and hydrothermal system may lose the structural integrity to keep containing the accumulated stress and pressure through gradual, non-explosive means, the way it largely has for the past 20 years. Past that threshold, the behavior of the system could shift, potentially making brittle failure, meaning fracturing of rock that opens new pathways for fluid and gas, and ultimately the conditions for volcanic or hydrothermal unrest meaningfully more likely. The paper's authors describe this as a transition, not a prophecy. They are also careful to point out something crucial about the mechanism at work here. Rather than each episode of uplift being a self-contained event that fully resets once it pauses, the data suggests the crust beneath Campi Flegrei retains memory of past deformation. Each cycle of stress appears to progressively weaken the rock's mechanical integrity rather than the system simply returning to its original baseline strength. In other words, this isn't a rubber band that snaps back into shape every time the pressure eases. It's more like metal fatigue, where repeated stress cycles gradually compromise the material, even during the periods when nothing dramatic appears to be happening on the surface. To understand how significant this reframing is, you have to look back at what happened the last time this region went through a comparable uplift crisis. Modern instrumented monitoring at Campi Flegrei effectively begins in the late 1960s, and the record shows two major post-war uplift episodes before the current one. Between 1969 and 1972, Pozzuoli's ground surface rose dramatically. Then again between 1982 and 1984, an even more intense episode struck, with the town center rising by as much as 1 to 2 meters in just a couple of years, an extraordinarily fast rate of deformation, accompanied by thousands of small earthquakes. During that 1983 to 1984 crisis, tens of thousands of residents were evacuated from central Pozzuoli as a precaution, because the pattern of accelerating uplift and swarm seismicity looked disturbingly similar to the documented lead-up to the 1538 eruption. That evacuation turned out to be precautionary. No eruption followed. The uplift eventually slowed, then reversed into a period of subsidence, and life in Pozzuoli gradually returned to something resembling normal, though the psychological scars of that crisis never fully went away for the generation that lived through it. Which brings us to the only historical eruption this system has actually produced in the modern era, the one every scientist studying Campi Flegrei ultimately measures everything else against. On September 29, 1538, after a run-up of unrest lasting years, an eruption began that built an entirely new mountain in about a week. Locals had actually started noticing new land emerging from areas that had previously been underwater as early as 1502, evidence of slow uplift that had been building for decades before anyone recognized what it meant. Unusual earthquake activity intensified through the 1530s, reaching an early peak in 1534 and then dramatically worsening in September of 1538 itself. On the 28th of that month, the day before the eruption began, residents reported feeling roughly 20 separate tremors between sunrise and sunset. The following night, the ground finally ruptured, and over the course of about a week, ash, pumice, and volcanic material built a brand new cone standing roughly 123 meters tall. That cone still exists today. It's called Monte Nuovo, which literally means new mountain, and you can still walk on it. The nearby village of Tripurgal was buried almost entirely, but because residents recognized the warning signs, the intensifying earthquakes, the swelling ground, and fled in the hours before the eruption actually began, the death toll was remarkably small, given the scale of destruction to the landscape itself. That eruption is classified as a VEI 3 on the Volcanic Explosivity Index, moderate by Campi Flegrei's own historical standards, but still significant enough to permanently reshape the coastline. Here's where perspective becomes genuinely important, because there's a massive difference between what Campi Flegrei has done in documented human history and what it is capable of doing at its absolute worst. And conflating the two is where most of the internet panic around this story goes wrong. The caldera itself, the giant depression the whole region sits inside, was formed by a colossal eruption known as the Campanian Ignimbrite eruption, which occurred roughly 39,000 years ago, one of the largest volcanic events in Europe during the entire Quaternary period, ejecting enormous volumes of material, and almost certainly playing a role in dramatic climate cooling across the region at the time. A second, somewhat smaller caldera-forming eruption, called the Neapolitan Yellow Tuff eruption, occurred around 15,000 years ago and further shaped the landscape that exists today. Those two eruptions are what earned this place its reputation as a supervolcano in the first place. But since that Neapolitan Yellow Tuff event 15,000 years ago, every single one of the roughly 70 eruptions that have occurred inside the caldera, including the 1538 event, has been vastly smaller than those original caldera-forming eruptions. Some produced lava domes, some were explosive hydromagmatic events driven by groundwater interacting with rising magma, but none of them have come remotely close to repeating a caldera collapse scale eruption. Researchers studying the long-term eruption record are explicit about this point. Looking purely at the last 4,000 years of activity, a full caldera-forming super-eruption recurring in the near future is not considered a likely scenario. The overwhelming weight of the historical and geological evidence points towards something on the scale of 1538 as the realistic upper bound of concern, not a repeat of the ancient event that carved out the caldera in the first place. That distinction matters enormously when you look at what current monitoring data is actually showing versus what it isn't showing. Just like at Yellowstone, where scientists have been clear that hydrothermal explosions are a completely different and far more localized hazard than a magmatic caldera eruption, Campi Flegrei researchers draw a similarly important line between the current bradyseismic unrest and any indication of fresh magma making a rapid ascent toward the surface. The geochemistry of the gases being released from fumaroles across the region, particularly the ratio of certain gas species escaping from the ground, has shown signatures over the past 2 decades that many researchers interpret as evidence of increasing magmatic input feeding the hydrothermal system from below, rather than this simply being an old system reheating itself without any fresh contribution. That's part of why the current uplift episode is being taken more seriously than the 2 post-war episodes in the 60s and 80s, both of which eventually reversed without producing an eruption. But taking it seriously and predicting an imminent eruption are 2 very different things, and researchers are careful, publicly and repeatedly, not to conflate the 2. The most likely eruptive scenario, according to volcanologists who have spent decades studying this specific caldera, would resemble something closer to 1538 than anything resembling a doomsday event. A localized eruption, likely producing pyroclastic flows and ashfall concentrated around the immediate vent area, would primarily threaten the towns closest to the eruption site, potentially requiring evacuation of a significant chunk of the roughly 500,000 people who live inside the officially designated red zone, the area assessed as being at highest direct risk from pyroclastic material in a future eruption. It would be genuinely catastrophic for the communities directly affected, and it would send ash and disruption across a wider area, including parts of Naples itself, a metropolitan region, home to roughly 3 million people. But it would not be a planet-altering, climate-disrupting mega-eruption of the kind Hollywood disaster films love to depict when the word supervolcano gets mentioned. The current data, the seismicity, the uplift rates, the gas geochemistry, all of it points toward a system that is becoming increasingly capable of a moderate 1538-style event, not toward one that is winding up for a repeat of the eruption that carved out the caldera 39,000 years ago. That said, even a moderate eruption at Campi Flegrei would be an enormously complicated emergency to manage, precisely because of who lives there and how densely they're packed together. This is, without exaggeration, one of the most volcanically exposed urban regions on the planet. Approximately 1.5 million people live within the caldera and its immediate surroundings, spread across Pozzuoli, itself home to around 80,000 residents, along with parts of western Naples, and the municipalities of Baccoli, Monte di Procida, Quarto, and Marano di Napoli. The red zone, specifically, the area planners have identified as being at greatest risk from pyroclastic flows in a future eruption, contains roughly 500,000 people. And this entire caldera sits right next door to Mount Vesuvius, the volcano that destroyed Pompeii in the year 79, meaning the wider Naples Bay area has to plan for volcanic risk from 2 separate active systems simultaneously, making it arguably the single most volcanically exposed metropolitan region anywhere in Europe. Italian civil protection authorities have spent years developing an emergency evacuation plan for exactly this scenario. And the plan itself illustrates just how difficult managing this risk actually is in practice. The current framework allows a window of roughly 3 days for residents in the highest risk zones to evacuate, either independently or with organized government assistance, once specific escalating warning signs are detected. 3 days sounds workable on paper. In reality, residents who have lived through prior crises describe deep skepticism about whether that timeline is realistic. The roads through towns like Pozzuoli are narrow, often congested, even on an ordinary day, and local residents worry openly about gridlock if hundreds of thousands of people attempt to leave the area at the same time through the same limited road network. One resident, describing his fear of what would actually happen if the evacuation order came, said he worried about immediate deadlock in his town's narrow streets. A fear echoed by many who have watched the alert levels shift over the past 2 decades, without ever quite reaching the point of a full evacuation order. Which raises the obvious next question: where does the official alert level currently stand, and what would actually need to happen for authorities to move toward a full evacuation? Italy uses a 4-tier volcanic alert system for Campi Flegrei, running from green, meaning normal background activity, through yellow, meaning attention, orange, meaning pre-alarm, up to red, meaning alarm and imminent eruption risk. Since 2012, the alert level has sat at yellow, attention, reflecting the persistent bradyseismic unrest, the ongoing uplift, and the elevated but not extreme seismicity. It has not been raised to orange despite the earthquake swarms of 2026, despite the magnitude 4 event in May, and despite the magnitude 7 event at the end of July. That distinction is important because it tells you that even with headlines describing this as a dangerous new phase, the scientific bodies actually monitoring the volcano in real time have not assessed the current data as indicating an eruption is imminent or even clearly probable in the near term. What has changed is not the alert level, it's the underlying trajectory, the multi-decade acceleration curve that the April 2026 research paper mathematically characterized for the first time, giving officials and the public an actual projected time frame, that early 2030s window, rather than just a vague sense that things have been getting worse. It's worth pausing here to address the comparisons that inevitably come up whenever a story like this breaks, because Campi Flegrei tends to get lumped together with Yellowstone in the public imagination, two supervolcanoes, two ticking time bombs, same category of doom, but the differences between what's happening at each site right now are actually significant. Yellowstone's current activity, including the closely watched hydrothermal disturbances at Biscuit Basin, is fundamentally a shallow steam and groundwater phenomenon, driven by pressure building in near-surface plumbing systems that are physically disconnected from any suggestion of magma actively rising toward the surface. Yellowstone's broader monitoring network shows no significant ground deformation pointing toward magmatic unrest, and its volcanic alert level remains at normal. Campi Flegrei's situation is different in character. The uplift here has been sustained, directional, and accelerating for over 20 straight years, not months, and it's accompanied by gas geochemistry that a meaningful portion of the scientific community interprets as showing an actual magmatic contribution feeding the system from depth, not purely a hydrothermal reshuffling. In plain terms, Yellowstone's recent unrest looks like a plumbing problem near the surface. Campi Flegrei's two-decade trend looks more like a structural fatigue problem building from below. Neither one currently shows evidence of an imminent large magnitude eruption, but they are not the same story, and treating every supervolcano headline as functionally identical does a disservice to how differently each of these systems actually behaves. So what should you actually take away from all of this, beyond the raw data? The honest answer is that Campi Flegrei represents a genuinely unusual scientific situation, a live volcanic system where, for the first time, researchers have applied a mathematical model sophisticated enough to project an actual window for a potential critical transition, rather than simply describing vague, open-ended concern the way volcanologists have had to for decades. That is a real, meaningful scientific development, and it deserves attention precisely because it's rare, not because it guarantees catastrophe. The earthquakes rattling Naples throughout 2026, the magnitude 4 event in May, the 70 earthquake week in February, the magnitude 7 event at the end of July that injured 24 people and cracked open a cliffside. These are not isolated incidents. They're data points inside a pattern that has been building with documented mathematical acceleration since 2005. If the current trend continues unchanged, researchers estimate uplift at the center of the caldera could approach 4 meters total by the early 2030s, a level that would exceed anything recorded during the 20th century crises of the 60s and 80s, the same crises that triggered mass evacuations even without an eruption ever occurring. Whether that trajectory holds, whether the system finds a way to release pressure gradually the way it appears to have done for most of the last 2 decades, or whether it crosses the threshold the April 2026 study identified, is genuinely one of the most important open questions in volcanology happening in real time on our own planet right now. Not in some remote, uninhabited wilderness, but underneath the homes of 1.5 million people who wake up every single day next to a bay that is quietly, measurably rising beneath their feet. For the people actually living inside that red zone, the practical reality hasn't fundamentally changed even with this new research. The alert level remains at attention, not alarm. Scientists are not calling for evacuation. What has changed is the clarity of the picture, the recognition that this isn't just background noise that will eventually fade the way it did in 1984, but potentially the build-up phase of something the historical record has only shown us once before in 5 centuries. INGV continues to monitor the caldera around the clock, tracking ground deformation through satellite positioning networks, tracking gas emissions from the Solfatara crater and dozens of other fumarole sites, and tracking every single tremor no matter how small. Because in a system like this, the pattern matters just as much as any individual event. The next major data point everyone is watching for is whether the seismicity keeps accelerating along the same mathematical curve the researchers identified, or whether, like it has twice before in the modern era, it eventually plateaus and begins to ease. Either answer will tell scientists an enormous amount about how seriously to treat that projected early 2030s window, and either answer will directly shape how prepared Naples and its surrounding towns need to be for what could be the most consequential volcanic event to strike mainland Europe in nearly 500 years. There's also a technological angle to this story that rarely gets mentioned outside academic papers. And it's worth understanding because it explains why researchers are so confident in the data, even while remaining cautious about the conclusions. The monitoring network sitting on top of Campi Flegrei today is dramatically more sophisticated than anything that existed during the 1980s crisis. Back then, ground deformation was tracked with periodic leveling surveys, teams physically measuring elevation changes at fixed benchmarks scattered across the region, a process that could only capture snapshots weeks or months apart. Today, continuous satellite positioning stations feed real-time vertical displacement data every few seconds, 24 hours a day, alongside a dense array of seismometers capable of detecting even the faintest microtremors long before they'd ever be felt by a person standing on the surface. Add to that continuous monitoring of gas flux and composition escaping from fumaroles across the caldera floor, and researchers now have a resolution of data on the system that simply didn't exist the last two times Pozzuoli's ground rose dramatically. That's precisely why a model like the finite time singularity analysis published in April 2026 was even possible in the first place. You cannot fit 26 years of high-resolution deformation and strain data to a mathematical curve if that data doesn't exist at sufficient density. And for most of Campi Flegrei's history, it simply didn't. This generation of scientists is, in a very real sense, the first to have the tools necessary to actually test whether this kind of slow-building unrest can be mathematically forecast at all, rather than simply described qualitatively after the fact. What makes this story genuinely different from typical volcano coverage is that we are, for the first time in this caldera's monitored history, watching a live experiment in whether cutting-edge mathematical modeling can actually forecast the trajectory of a slow-building volcanic crisis before it fully arrives. Every earthquake swarm, every centimeter of uplift, every fresh measurement of gas composition rising out of the ground at Solfatara is another data point feeding directly into that model, refining it, testing it, either confirming the accelerating curve or revealing that the system has found a way to ease off the way it has twice before. Nobody, not the researchers who built the model, not the officials managing the red zone evacuation plans, not the residents who have learned to sleep a little lighter every time the ground trembles, actually knows for certain which way this goes. What we do know is that the ground beneath one of Europe's most historic and densely populated coastlines has risen more than 1.5 meters in 20 years, that the earthquakes accompanying that rise are getting sharper and more frequent, and that for the first time, scientists have put a number on when this particular chapter of the story might reach its turning point. Whatever happens between now and the early 2030s, this is a place worth watching closely, because the last time this exact pattern played out in full, back in 1538, it ended with a brand new mountain rising out of the Italian coastline in less than a week. We'll keep tracking every update out of INGV, every new swarm, every fresh reading on that uplift curve, so make sure you're subscribed for when the next development breaks. If this deep dive into Europe's most closely watched volcanic system helped you understand what's actually happening beneath Naples, share it with someone who'd find it just as fascinating. Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and we'll see you in the next one.